James McCann is a member of the Riverwood Christadelphian ecclesia, and he joins Wilderness Conversations today to speak about his recent studies in Ezra. James, thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations. We wanted to talk to you about Ezra. You've done some studies recently in Ezra, and I definitely get the feeling that I'm sure you don't have a favourite, but it's perhaps one of your favourite sections of the scripture. Would I be right?
Well, I think anytime you study something, it becomes your favourite. But this one actually, I suppose, just took me by surprise. I was actually asked to do an exhort. I think it was at Bullaroo a few years ago, and I was just looking up the readings when you first get the information sent through to you by the recorder, and it was like, I think it was Ezra 7 was the reading, and I went, oh, Ezra 7, I don't know much about Ezra at all. And then suddenly I just thought, oh, well, I'll read the book in its context, and I'll do a little bit of thinking and reading, and funnily enough, the opening phrase in Ezra was that God stirred up, Cyrus, and he stirred up the people, and suddenly that just got inside of me, like that God was stirring up, God was at work in this generation, and suddenly it stirred me up. So look, it's definitely one of my favorites now, and one that I suppose I love to talk about all the time, but it's just because how powerful God was to change a person and a generation and an ecclesia at that time. And I thought, well, we need that now. That's what we all need as individuals and what we need as ecclesias, and it was just so fantastic. So yeah, I love it.
We'll see if we can get to some of those points. Perhaps even look at the man himself and also what he did for the ecclesia at the time. But I thought it might be worthwhile just getting our bearings and getting the broader context. And I find it, I have to almost go back every time I think about it to sort of put all the pieces in place. You've got Ezra and Nehemiah, you've got Zerubbabel and Joshua, you've got sort of the end of Daniel. In all of that, you've got Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and all of those sort of the pieces. How do they all fit together?
Well, one of the hard things in piecing all this together is that in the Bible, it doesn't necessarily flow, chronologically. So one of the hard things is just trying to actually see, all right, well, as you said, where do each of these pieces go? But the interesting thing is that sometimes they're actually placed in the canon of Scripture because of the commonality. So, for instance, Ezra and Nehemiah would obviously go together, but you might go, well, why is it placed, for instance, next to Chronicles? And why, if Ezra and Nehemiah are towards the end of the Old Testament, are they placed, in the middle and towards the start of it?
Good question.
To get, I suppose the context, the overall context is Israel had come out of Egypt. They had the period of the judges, then the period of the kings. And of course, as the various kings had, particularly in Judah, there'd be the up and down of the good king and the bad king. But to the north, they were just all rotten. And of course, God promised that, I'd taken you into the land. It's my land. But if you don't appreciate the importance of my principles and how they're connected to the land, then I will spew you out. And ultimately, we come to the end of where God carried out that promise. And he did take them into captivity. So we have particularly people like Daniel who went into captivity, and we've got, Ezekiel who went into captivity, and they would fall after, of course, the major prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah, who predicted the Babylonian conquest. But then as they were in captivity, these faithful men were trying to say to the nation, always remember that God has promised that after 70 years, he will bring you back. Don't forget that promise. And so therefore, as we come to the end of those 70 years, now we have on the scene the beginning of the first part of Ezra, as God now stirs up not only the Medo-Persian Empire, and particularly Cyrus, to allow the Jews to go back, to build the temple and the walls, etc. But then you also have those stories that intertwine amongst them. So Ezra leads on from the building of the temple into Nehemiah, which is the building of the wall. So funnily enough, originally they were actually seen, particularly like in the Septuagint, as the first and second Esdras, like the first and second of Ezra. They were seen combined. And then you have particularly Haggai and Zechariah, who God sends as prophets in the middle of the first section of Ezra. So Ezra is split up into chapters 1 to 6, which was Zerubbabel and Joshua, as you mentioned, who are the leaders and a king priest in that sense, sending back the nation to restore it and to build it again. And the people again lapsed into this malaise, and that's where God actually had to stir them up again. And that's the role of Haggai and Zechariah, particularly in getting the people going again, because there was about a 15-year period where the people had lost their way in building the temple and had turned to building their own houses. So that's the first part of Ezra, I suppose. And the chronology is always a little bit challenging, and there's differences of views and thoughts on exactly how it all fits together. But I would suggest that in between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7 is the story of Esther. That's where Esther fits into the record as well. So you've got Esther and Mordecai.
So just before you go into the second part, the gap in between chapter 6 and chapter 7 is perhaps larger than certainly I assumed initially. And also the fact that in the first 6 chapters of Ezra, Ezra's not really involved. He steps in halfway through the book in chapter 7.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where, look, there are two main schools of thought, I suppose, on exactly how that chronology works and who the Persian kings were, exactly as to Esther's Persian king and, the ones that were under Ezra and Nehemiah. However, I would suggest that the book that best helped me was The Return of the Exiles by Brother Ashton. I think his chronology is the one that I sort of felt made the most sense. I'm definitely not an expert in that regard, but having looked at, his chronology and other writings, I felt that his matched better with the facts as I saw them all coming together. So yeah, I would suggest that there's almost a 65-year gap between the end of chapter 6 and then the start of Ezra coming back himself personally in chapter 7. So Joshua and Zerubbabel were the main leaders that brought the first wave of the people back to the land. And I'd probably say that would have been around about 536 BC. But if we then come to Ezra chapter 7, on the second wave that we return under Ezra personally, I would say that'd be around about 458 BC. Approximately. And then when we go into Nehemiah, and that's why it leaves Ezra sort of hanging with this, well, why does Ezra just stop the way it does at the end of chapter 10? Well, if we then read on into Nehemiah, we can see that the story continues, and that was the third wave, which is approximately 444 BC that Nehemiah returns. So that's, I think, the chronology that best fits the kings and the people and how they all fit together in that regard. Now, a little connection that you made before to Daniel, it's interesting in Daniel chapter 1 that it gives us an overview of Daniel's life, and it says, and Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus. Now, why tell us that? I think it's actually linking us to the story of Ezra chapter 1, where Cyrus was stirred up, and I believe Daniel was a part of that stirring up, to return the people back. And as if Daniel is telling us that even as an old man, he lived to see that final moment where Jeremiah's promise of them returning after 70 years occurred.
Yeah, you've got the reference to the vessels of gold at the start of Daniel and then at the start of Ezra and start of the return as well, which seems to link those two ideas together as well.
Yeah, and all of that comes from Jeremiah. So Jeremiah was the first one that when he wrote to the captives, he tried to tell them that the vessels of God's house were being taken into captivity and that God would care for those good figs over in the land of captivity, as if to say that the vessels are actually the people. God's more interested, obviously, in the people. And now in Ezra chapter 1, as we see God fulfilling his promise, he's saying, yes, I've kept you safe all that time. Now go back. Now go back to the land that, I promised to your fathers. And the vessels were meant to be going back as people to restore the temple and to build it again. That was the exciting work that Zerubbabel and Joshua are going to carry out. So
from the very first start of this story where Joshua and Zerubbabel leave to almost the end, I guess, at the end of the story of Nehemiah, it's almost a 100-year history, which is a surprisingly length of time, isn't it?
Yeah. And the other one you mentioned before, too, is Malachi fits into the end of that as well, because Malachi fits into the end of Nehemiah, where Nehemiah, of course, went back. And during that period of time, again, there is the rot setting back in amongst the people. And, where Nehemiah had to come back, he had to come back and set many of the people straight again. And that was the prophets trying to warn the people that they were, turning away and moving away from God.
And the first wave were the ones that built the temple first, and then the walls were built after the temple was completed, which usually you would think you would do it the other way around. You'd establish the walls, get the security in place, but in fact, they did it the other way around, which was fascinating.
Yeah, I must say I did find that rather strange at first, but I think, again, it comes down to the promises that God had made. And that's where, again, it fits into the time period of the early part of Ezra, because it reads, again, as if it's all happening so quickly and so sequentially. But there was a period of time where God had actually said there would be a 70-year period. And we've got to also understand, and it's looking at the chronology, they went into to captivity a little bit earlier, but the temple itself was not actually destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar until some years later. So therefore, there was a 70-year period that the temple also had to lay quiet and waste. And that is why when they did return to start to build the temple and the foundations, there was some 15 years later that they actually finished it. There was a period of time where they lost their way due to the challenges that they faced. And in Ezra chapter 4 particularly, you can see the opposition that they faced. And you kind of think, well, why did they go back, and why did God allow them to face that opposition? And I think, again, that's what makes the wonder of the book of Ezra for us individuals now in our generation, is because God was always trying to develop faith in them by saying, do you trust me? Do you believe in my word? Yes, even going back, you've done the right thing in leaving Babylon behind, but you still have to put your 100% faith in me to carry out my word. And even through the difficulties and the trials, God was going to be a wall to them. And that's what they had to understand. It wasn't so much that the physical walls would protect them. They had to appreciate that God was going to be their protection and their walls. And would they truly believe that and be able to carry out his work with that faith in mind? I think that was the challenge they faced.
And that protection was realized through the person of Cyrus, who'd been prophesied 70 years before by Isaiah, that he would in fact be the shepherd that would bring them back. Another fascinating thing.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the beauty of it, is that phrase in Isaiah 45, where it says, and, I will raise him up in righteousness, Isaiah says, that is exactly the same phrase that's used in Ezra chapter 1, that he stirred up the spirit of Cyrus. It's exactly the same phrase. And I think that's a powerful connection, because that's the way God stirs us up. His word has the power to stir us up, because when we look at how accurate and how powerful it is, it can only but convince you that God is behind that. So for God to name that shepherd, for God to actually tell us exactly how he would do that, even the details in Isaiah 44 and Isaiah 45 tell us, in a sense, how Cyrus was to conquer the gates and destroy Babylon. It's just amazing detail, to the point that, we can understand why in Daniel was standing right there at the very night that Cyrus burst through the walls and burst into to get rid of the Babylonian Empire. And that's why I believe Daniel was placed there with the writing, many, many tickle you fast. And that's why he was called in at that night, because God was actually going at that very night to have Cyrus walk in, and here would be Daniel with a gold chain on, and he'd say, welcome, Cyrus. God's been expecting you for over 200 years. I mean, that would have blown Cyrus's socks off, and he would have gone, what do you mean? And, here it is in the Bible. Back in Isaiah, God's been expecting you, Cyrus, and he has a work for you to do. And now he's actually about to call you to do a more important work. And that's exactly what Cyrus says in chapter 1. He goes, God has commanded me to build him a house. Like he's obeying the God of heaven, because the God of heaven is mapping out his life before him. The word of God is so powerful, it'll convince us that the God of heaven and earth does rule in the kingdoms of men.
Another occasion where Daniel has this incredible influence over the leader of the world empire. Extraordinary.
Yeah, but look at how that flowed on then into Ezra and Nehemiah. The story is fantastically the same, because in Ezra chapter 7, here he is standing in front of Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes writes a letter, and he writes a letter to actually command that Ezra, this prophet of the Most High God, the God of heaven, is off to beautify the temple, and he gives him all that he needs. And he actually keeps talking about how God has commanded and worked in Ezra's life for him to do this. And then in Nehemiah, Nehemiah again is right there by the king's side when he just happens to be the king's cupbearer. And again, God is going to work in Nehemiah to go back and to build the walls. I mean, God used his messengers at the most perfect times in human history and placed them where he wanted to place them, because he was going to do extraordinary things with them. And I just find, again, that's the sort of stuff that stirs me up when I read the word of God, that God is just in control of everything. And we ought to be able to be confident that our God is going to work in our good times and our bad times to bring about his plan and purpose.
So in the first 6 chapters of Ezra, which is actually before we're introduced to the man Ezra, this first section of Ezra,
yep.
What are some of the key ideas that come out of this, and what were some of the lessons that you gained from that first section of Ezra?
Oh, yeah, there's amazing array of things in that. So, for instance, one of the ones is chapter 2 with the chronologies, and everyone loves reading chronologies when they do their Bible readings. But, for instance, particularly from chapter 1, I loved how, and you already mentioned this idea about the vessels. I love the idea that God had numbered the vessels. He'd individually numbered them all, and he numbered them and he gave them into the hand of this man called Sheshbazzar. And because of that, what you actually have is Sheshbazzar given the responsibility to bring up the vessels out of captivity. Now, immediately as you go into chapter 2, we're introduced to Zerubbabel. And again, it says, these are the people that came with Zerubbabel. So what you have is the record linking the vessels with Sheshbazzar and the people with Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel and Sheshbazzar are literally the one and the same person. And it's because the Bible is trying to record this very unique and important man. Zerubbabel is a man of signs, says Zechariah, because he is an amazing type of the Lord Jesus Christ. So I loved when I saw in all of these things that God is actually portraying our life in this as well. It's about us as his vessels in captivity, and we're numbered with him by baptism. We're linked with him, and we have our hope only if we're bound up in him. And he's going to bring us out of captivity. And we are part of the ones who will be returned to our inheritance, if you want to put it that way, because that's what chapter 2 is about, the number of the people who receive their inheritance back again, that was given under Joshua, because they were numbered with that one man, Zerubbabel. They came with him. They were part of him. So I love this idea that how the Bible always paints Christ underneath all of these stories and says to all of us, hey, look at your life and see that you're in captivity, you're in Babylon, and your hope is that you're going to be drawn and taken out of the captivity of sin and death if you're numbered and linked with that one man Christ. And that's why one of the most powerful things in chapter 1 is the question that is asked. It says, who is there among you of all his people? I just find that such a personal question. Am I going to respond to that call to be raised up, to leave Babylon behind, to associate myself with my Redeemer, Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel, and leave Babylon behind to go to the promised land, to the inheritance? And I think that's the call of the promised people of God to leave Babylon behind. I find that very powerful in the early part of Ezra.
The story of redemption, leaving the old world behind into the wilderness and off to the promised land. It's the same since day one, isn't it? And we all go through the same process.
Yeah, even today. And that's why I thought it was so exciting, because here is God stirring up Cyrus. And what I found so significant to our generation today is that we have seen, I think in the last 5, possibly 10 years, we have seen some of the most profound fulfillment of scripture that any generation, I think, has seen. And even to the point which, when I was doing this study, I came across a coin that the Jewish people had printed on the 70-year anniversary, which was only a few years ago.
Yep.
And they had printed this coin, and on it they'd actually put the head of Cyrus, but right next to it they'd actually put the head of Trump. And it's because Trump was president at the time, and because he was actually doing things like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, telling the Jews that the Golan Heights belonged to them, all of these sorts of things.
Building the relationship with what we know as Scibe and Dedan. He was doing that all behind the scenes.
The Abraham Accords started with Trump.
Yeah, that's come out after he left.
But he began that.
He did
and
that, yeah.
And it was kind of like, well, why did the Jewish people commemorate this coin and put his head on it? Now, because he, like Cyrus, was the leader of the then known world, pretty much. And God had somehow, whether he works through, the good or the bad, he will work through the tyrants of the world if he needs to, like Cyrus and Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, he calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant. He calls Cyrus, my shepherd. That's not because these were lovely, polite gentlemen. These were because they had an important work to do that God was going to take his people back through. And they said, we know that, he is beginning a prophetic, work to build again the third temple, as if they could see that this is now coming to the end where the final temple would be built. And we're expecting Christ any time to return. And the first thing he's going to do after raising the dead and judgment, he's going to establish his throne and the temple in Jerusalem. So I just thought, wow, how, as if the angels are rattling our cages saying, be stirred up, be excited. This is like as if Ezra being applicable to us in our generation. Wake up, we're nearly there. Leave Babylon behind. Get excited about the truth and stirred up to go back. It might be hard, it might be difficult at times, but there's hope in God and there's no hope in the world. And I think that's the wonderful message of Ezra.
Oh, it's an exciting message. I have a question. I don't know the answer, and I don't know if you've given much thought, but Zerubbabel was a descendant of Zedekiah, who was the last king of Israel. And we know that Ezekiel prophesied that, it would be overturned, and there would not be a king that would sit on the throne of Israel until he who comes whose right it is, which we look forward to the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. And even today, there's a prime minister and not a king. And Ezra, even though he was in the line of the kings of Judah, when he came back, he was not established as a king. Have you given any thought, or is there any reasons that we know that didn't happen? I find that fascinating.
Yeah, look, I could give you an answer as to what I think it is, but I don't think that's necessarily right. It's just more the fact that for me, when I was looking at this, that's what actually highlighted the importance of Zerubbabel. Because, yes, that passage is quoted from Ezekiel 21. Yes, God was no longer going to allow there to be a king on the throne in Israel until it was Christ's turn. But the beautiful thing is he paints Zerubbabel as a type. This whole book, and even into Nehemiah, is actually a cameo of Christ and what he's going to do when he returns. And each of those elements are brought out in the story of Ezra. But what's fascinating is when you go and have a look at the genealogy here in chapter 2, you go, why is there a genealogy there? And why is chapter 1 so focused on Zerubbabel being the person by which all of these people are linked to? Well, when you go then to the New Testament, it's interesting that the chronologies of Christ, both from Matthew 1 and Luke 3, follow particularly Matthew follows a very careful chronology that seemingly follows Ezra's chronology and the chronology that the Chronicles of the Kings and the Chronicles were put together. Now, one of the things that is powerful is Ezra, I believe, is definitely the author of the book of Chronicles. And when you start to see it like that, you can see the chronology in Chronicles also now have a lot more power. But interestingly, both the line of Matthew 1 and Luke 3 both come together under Zerubbabel. They both literally come to this focal point under Zerubbabel and show that he is like the pivot by which the old, line of Christ that came through from King David is actually raised up. Right.
So just clarifying that. So Matthew has David and then it goes through to Solomon right down to Zerubbabel, whereas Luke has David and then Nathan.
Yes.
A different line, but it comes back to Zerubbabel at that point.
Yes. And I know for some people that chronologies are a little bit boring, but I found it extremely amazing as to why it's even recorded, because the Chronicles record and the Matthew 1 record, so 1 Chronicles 3 and Matthew 1, follow the kingly line, the legal line. So David, Solomon, and all the way down to Jeconiah, which we know Jeconiah was told that virtually he would have no seed, that, he would go childless into captivity, that line, finishing with Zedekiah, was overturned. That was it. The kingly line was overturned until Christ would come. So how was God going to raise up, the line of David? Well, he did that. The biological line, I believe, is what Luke records. So through Nathan, and then it comes together at the focal point at Zerubbabel. So what I think we're, powerfully being told is that Zerubbabel plays a vital connective role in linking the line of David and the line of Christ together. And when you follow Matthew 1, you can see that it's split up into 3 groups of 14. And you go, okay, I get that. I can see that it would pivot at David. So the first 14 would pivot at David. Okay, he's a notable figure. But why would the next pivot be at Zerubbabel at the time of the, pretty much the time of the Babylonian captivity? Well, that's because Zerubbabel is a vital and important connecting link between David, who's the king, and that's the emphasis in Matthew 1, and Christ, who is the king, the ultimate king by which all of those were pointing forward to. So David's line is raised up through Nathan, probably through a levirate marriage, but Zerubbabel is the one that's being painted here as the type of Christ. He raises up a dead line like he does Adam's, and he's the son that is given by God to be the one, who would bring life. So I think that's an absolute beautiful little connection, that if we didn't have Ezra recording this pivotal time of history, we wouldn't have the connection of how Christ was the rightful king, how Christ was going to sit on the throne of his father David. He was the one who all of those promises came to pivot on. So yeah, for me, I found that remarkably beautiful, that how the chronologies of the Bible come together to paint for us who Christ is. And I think Zerubbabel, therefore, plays a pivotal role in painting a type of Christ that we can see in his generation that people would have looked forward to.
So that's Ezra 1 to 6. Then we have this gap of 50 to even 60 years. And then we have Ezra introduced in Ezra chapter 7. Just before we get into that, a little bit about Ezra and the role we think he played with regard to the scriptures. Because he was Ezra the scribe, and we attribute to him perhaps the writing of the Chronicles, and perhaps even the gathering together of much of the canon of the scripture, but potentially as well at this point in time.
Yeah, I think Ezra plays a huge role in gathering particularly many of the Old Testament passages, probably even collating them into a particular order. We also know that he wrote a lot more than just that. I mean, I actually believe he's the scribe for Nehemiah. I mean, you only need to look at the fingerprint of Ezra, but through the Chronicles and Ezra itself, and you can see it in Nehemiah. I believe Nehemiah is obviously the author, but I think Ezra is still part of it as the scribe. We know that there were other Psalms even that were connected and linked together, placed in particular order, and I believe, again, some Psalms that even Ezra is responsible for writing. One of the studies I think we looked at, particularly Psalm 105 and 106, and showed how they linked very much back to both the words of Ezra and Nehemiah, and played out beautifully into Nehemiah 12, where there are 2 groups of people that once the wall was made, there were 2 choirs, one led by Ezra and one led by Nehemiah, that moved in opposite directions around the walls, singing praise and thanks to God. And the very words, to praise and to give thanks to God, that's mentioned in Nehemiah 12 is exactly the theme of those Psalms in Psalm 105 and 106. So again, I think that Ezra is responsible for a lot more, not only the gathering and the connecting of the scriptures in the Old Testament for us, but even just recording in this pivotal time in history some of the most important events that link the promises made to the fathers to the fulfillment of that in the New Testament in Christ.
He was a man that was almost a mirror of Moses. You get a lot of echoes back to Moses in his life, I think. And he's not the only one. I think Joshua and there are others, but Ezra was like Joshua and other faithful Old Testament characters, was very connected with the writings of Moses.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that comes out very strongly in Ezra 3 as well as Ezra 7 is his continual referencing not only of Moses but also of David and of Solomon, as if and I took powerfully from that what Ezra was doing and what Zerubbabel and Joshua did when they returned is that if they were going to come back to the land and establish the land, then they looked simply to the Bible as their source by which that would guide them on their decisions on how they would do things. So, for instance, in chapter 3, and it's like a cool little colouring exercise you can go through, and this happens in chapter 7 as well. It says, they built the altar of God of Israel, offer burnt offerings, as it is written in the law of Moses. And it actually mentions that multiple times, as it is written, according to the custom, as the duty of every day required, as the set feast of Yahweh. And he even says, and he calls Moses the man of God, as if he's saying, we need to go back to our Bibles, listen very carefully to what the faithfuls of old did, and that is what we're going to establish here. Because we've got to remember that they didn't have the Urim and Thummim, Ezra 2 verse 63 says, and they didn't have, therefore, that direct inspiration from God. And that's the same for us. We don't have direct speaking from God in our generation. We have the Bible. That's it. So to us, we go back to the Bible, and that's what we base our life on, and that's what we base our decisions on. And in Ezra chapter 7 particularly, there's a beautiful little core to the whole book, and I think it's Ezra 7 verse 10. I think that sums up Ezra the man and his mission and everything that he wanted to be known for, really. And that was that tells us not only who he is, but it says that Ezra set his heart to seek the law, to do it, and to teach statutes and judgments in Israel. So he was a man whose love and passion for the law of God was so evident in his own life that he sought carefully what God wanted. He would listen to the faithfuls of old, and that's what he did. And he wanted, therefore, his own life to model for others in his ecclesia what God's statutes and judgments should look like. And I think that was something that really drove him and drives everything to the point in Ezra 7. There's two little phrases in Ezra 7 where even a Gentile king actually says, and I think it's worth noting, in Ezra 7, it actually says in verse 14, as the king's writing this letter, he goes, according to the law of thy God, which is in your hand. I just love that, like as if this king is looking at Ezra and going, Ezra, you do exactly what the law of your God says, and there it is, you're holding it. Like, we have our phones and all that today, so carrying a Bible around is not that hard. But in his generation, carrying around a big scroll, the word of God in your hand, I can just imagine, this big scroll sticking out of his pocket, every day, because that's the sort of man he was. I know that's a bit of a comical way of looking at it, but, people noted that the word of God was in his hand. That's what drove everything that he did. And so for me, the lesson, the word of God is not only powerful, it can stir us up, but we've got to get into it, and if we want our ecclesias and our families and our own lives to be on track, then we've got to be people of the book, people listening to what God's statutes and judgments are, because they're not only right for us, but they're good for us as well.
And we live in a time where we're challenged by the philosophies of the world, and people have their own ideas and they talk about their own feelings, and I feel this and I feel that and I think this and think that. It's such a timely reminder that it's really the word of God that we should be turning to get that understanding of how we ought to behave and where we ought to focus our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I just think Ezra that's what stirred me up in a sense, is that I just found it so applicable. This is what I need individually. Like I need to get my head back into the word of God daily. And if we want God's statutes and judgments to be our guide, then we need to know what they are. And, if you go through particularly Ezra 3, they did everything of the building of the altar exactly as the law of Moses said. They did everything of the offerings exactly as the word of God said. Ezra actually even reestablished the Levites in their courses, down to the very fact that he told them exactly what to play on their instruments and what to wear. And he did all of that from the word of God. Like it actually says, according to what, God told David. So it's as if he's going back to David and back to Moses, back to Solomon, and he's saying, okay, what's exactly what the Bible says? That's what we're going to do. And I love that attitude, because, if we don't have that attitude today, as you said, it's our feelings that'll creep in. Well, I feel this or I feel that. And it's kind of going, nah, it's God that it's what he feels and what he wants. It's his statutes and judgments that should be in our life, not mine or yours or anyone else's.
And in all of this, we're talking about Ezra a lot. And I know that people had their challenges and difficulties, but they responded and they followed Ezra and did what he said. It's not like he was doing it on his own. He was able to inspire a whole generation of brothers and sisters.
Yeah, absolutely. And more than that, like, sometimes it's hard for us because we think, well, we look at the numbers of the people that responded and we kind of go, well, that wasn't that many people that responded. And, we shouldn't despise the day of small things, Zechariah tells the people at that time as well. But I think what he did, shows us that one person can have such a mighty effect. And, forget how many people might respond, or, if we strive with all our heart to say, no, I'm going to be one of those people who put up their hand and say, yes, I'm one of those who God says, who amongst you of all these people are going to be, go back to the land and start building, then we might often bring, a whole host of people with us and inspire others to stand up. And, you mentioned Ezra particularly. I mean, in chapter 9, there's a crisis in the ecclesia, and they come to Ezra. And in Ezra 9 and 10, they actually say, look, Ezra, you have courage, you do it, and we'll follow you. Sometimes we really do need some people to, in our ecclesias, to stand up. And I mean, I know personally in my life, I feel very blessed to have been part of an ecclesia where I've had so many wonderful people who are like Ezra's to me, who are passionate to the word of God, who have taught me to seek the law and to do it, and therefore have been people that I can look up to. And I think that's something that I would love to do in my own life for others. And, what I love to do in my job at Heritage and things like that is just try to be someone, just try to be someone who others can be inspired by, to find God and to try to, model God's statutes and judgments as best as you can. I know that I'm a failing individual like everyone, but probably me more so than others, but it's just more that I just, God is a wonderful God, and what he's written is so true. And we want to get as many of our young people and our family into the kingdom as we can. So, let's be inspired and raised up to show those things to the ecclesias and our families as much as we can, because we will influence people for good, towards God.
And he did all of this with some significant opposition, increasingly through the course of the book. The opposition becomes more fierce and perhaps more sophisticated. I think it's quite interesting. So in the same way that we're faced in our ecclesial life, our personal life, with those who oppose the principles for which we stand, it was no different then.
Yeah, and particularly if you go into this, as you're right, it did become more sophisticated. As you go into the book of Nehemiah, it really did become to the point where, unfortunately, one of the high priests, Elisha, was taken hook, line, and sinker, and allowed the opposition in there. But the wonderful thing about Ezra is that when people heard him talk, they stopped and they listened, because they knew what came out of his mouth was what God would say. And to the point where he had a conscience. And this is the thing I love about him. It's one of those things where it's easy for us to proclaim to others the word of God, and maybe not in our own lives, reflect that same character. People don't see what happens in our life, for instance. And as long as we, project the image, that's all that matters and that's so totally wrong and totally against what Ezra would do. And there's a little example in Ezra 8 of his conscience, because in Ezra chapter 7, he asks the king to send him back to beautify the temple. And he says, that God is the God of heaven, and ultimately, his wrath is against those who don't do what he wants. But in saying that to the king, he then decided to actually go back to the land without any protection from the king's soldiers. And in chapter 8, he says, the reason that I didn't take any soldiers back to protect us is because I had told the king that God's wrath would be against those who do the wrong thing, and his grace would be towards those who did the right thing. And therefore he knew that in his own conscience, he had to stand by his words and say, well, if God is supporting me, then he will take us safely back to the land. Now, can you imagine for those 4 months traveling back without any protection from the king's soldiers, how you would have felt? But he knew he had to stand by what he preached, so his conscience from his preaching was seen in his own individual conduct in his own life. And I just find that inspirational.
The end of the story of Ezra, and where Ezra disappears off the scene, there's a crossover with Nehemiah. When we get to the end of Nehemiah, has Ezra gone? Was he an older person than what Nehemiah was, probably?
Yeah, I definitely think he was an older man. And that's where, it does become a little bit hard, because Ezra definitely plays a back seat in the book of Nehemiah. And you kind of think, well, why wasn't Ezra here in this record? I think we have got to be careful that, because we're not told what he was doing, that we sort of make some surmising of what he wasn't there, or he wasn't standing up, or, that's sort of like arguing from, unknowns. But he does crop up in significant places in Nehemiah, particularly in Nehemiah 8 and again in Nehemiah 12. He crops up in very significant and public roles to lead the people. So I just believe he humbly, as the scribe to Nehemiah, is focusing on the work of Nehemiah and the wonderful role that Nehemiah played.
So Nehemiah comes in. Nehemiah's probably a younger man.
Yep.
He's probably got the enthusiasm. He takes over leading the people.
Yep. But
Ezra's there the whole time. And as you say, almost certainly writing the book of Nehemiah, writing the story. It's probably at that time he's doing all of the other writing that he's doing as well, and the work that he's doing with the canon of scripture.
Yeah. And it might be that, like Nehemiah had to go back at times. It might have been that Ezra had to return back at a time. I don't know. All we know is that he crops up at significant portions of leadership. And that's where we have a record of him continuing to do amazing things for the people. We
mentioned that the book of Ezra ends with sort of a start, and we flow into the book of Nehemiah. Well, Nehemiah kind of ends a bit like that as well, doesn't it? Sort of, you feel like it's an unfinished story.
Yeah, and it is, because I think that's where Malachi actually records for us, is that there's going to come a time where the refiner's fire will come, he will suddenly come to his temple. And I think that it's leaving us with the picture of the challenges that the people faced at that time. But ultimately, that's the thing that all, those who go through this, valley of the shadow of death will experience. And the ecclesia was definitely needed more Nehemiahs and more Ezras at that time. And when Christ came onto the scene, Christ came onto the scene when Israel was at one of its lowest points in time, and that's where, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son to demonstrate the very weakness that we all need salvation from. So I think in many respects, they both finish on that sort of unfinished business, because they're pointing forward to someone greater who will come and ultimately finish it. But the key issues that both the end of Ezra and the end of Nehemiah raise are the issues of, their single-minded focus and love of God's statutes and judgments. And I think that's where, for us, the story should be, well, how should we, in our generation today, be looking, in these sort of things? We should be trying to, in our life as well, to overcome those challenges and to make sure that our single-minded focus is on that time when our Messiah will suddenly come, when that, messenger of the covenant will come to his temple, and he will be a refiner's fire. So we need to look forward to that, and not, fear that, but look forward to that by respecting the way we ought to live according to his statutes and judgments now.
It's been great to be reminded of the story and the importance of Ezra and Nehemiah. James, thanks for joining Wilderness Conversations.
Thank you very much. Any chance to talk about Ezra is a good one.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.